Ek gesels vanoggend met Dr. Hayley Clements van Universiteit Stellenbosch en ons praat 'n bietjie oor renosters en die jongste getalle. Dr. Clements, welcome to Grootplaas.
Thanks, Mia. Pleased to be on the show.
To start off, I think just to give a bit of context, how does the current situation look when it comes to our rhino population in South Africa?
So if we look across the country, what we are starting to see is a decline in the number of white rhinos. And it's not looking so great for black rhinos either. Now, white rhinos are actually a good success story when it comes to conservation historically. In the 60s, we had about 100 white rhinos left in the country. And thanks to policies that recognized that Verliese Park by itself was not going to conserve this species, they started to allow private landowners to also conserve rhinos, so to move some of those rhinos from state parks, first to Verliese and then other state parks like the Kruger, over to private properties. And so we saw an incredible increase in the number of white rhinos as a result. And in about 2010, we had almost 20,000 white rhinos in the country. But since then, poaching has really escalated. Demand for rhino horn to supply medicinal markets in Asia. And so over the last decade, we've seen a decline in white rhinos across the country from that 19,000 or close to 20,000 a decade ago to just 13,000 today. And we've seen particularly bad declines in the Kruger Nasionale Park. It used to conserve 10,000 of those 19,000 rhinos. Today, it only conserves 2,000 rhinos. So really, not a great story for the Kruger in particular over the last decade.
What is happening with policy and law, and what's the latest on that?
So when it comes to rhino conservation, we need to think both internationally in terms of international policy as well as national policy. And again, as I mentioned, South Africa's policy really helped the recovery of the rhino population in terms of allowing private landowners to conserve and actually own rhinos on their properties and utilize those rhinos, for example, for ecotourism, to sell them between each other, and for trophy hunting. And because of those national policies, there was incentive for private landowners to conserve these rhinos and grow their populations. So in that respect, national policy has been really good. But what we're seeing now is that because of poaching, those benefits that we used to have from rhinos on private land are insufficient now for the rising costs of poaching. And this brings us also into the international policy domain, because many private rhino custodians will say that something else that could generate revenues from rhinos that could help cover the costs, the rising costs of protecting those rhinos from poaching, is legalizing the international trade in horn. So currently poaching is caused by an illegal trade in rhino horn. And many proponents of trade say that if trade was legalized, that would provide an additional revenue stream for both state parks to fund conservation and for private individuals. Now that trade is currently, it's legal locally, domestically, but it's banned internationally. So there's these two levels of policy that are relevant when it comes to rhino conservation.
And the fact stands is this can cause a very heated debate, because there are people on both sides of the fence. And I always wonder, but what more can and should be done to stop poaching, to stop the target on our rhinos? According to, you or your expert opinion, what are some of the things that should be done more?
Yeah, so I think what the argument we tried to make in the paper is first to alert people to where rhinos now are, and then, what kind of solutions can be supporting those different methods of rhino conservation. because I think what people don't realize is how many of the rhinos that remain are actually on private land. So as I mentioned, particularly because rhino numbers have been declining so dramatically in state parks like the Kruger and also some of the Ezemvelo parks in KwaZulu-Natal. The current situation is that over half of the country's rhinos are now on private land. About 7,000 of those 13,000 are on private land. So when we think about how to stop poaching and to promote conservation of rhinos, we need to recognize that we might need slightly different mechanisms for rhinos in state parks that are supported by taxpayer money, as well as tourism to those parks, and the private sector, where the bill for conserving those rhinos really falls squarely into the hands of those private landowners. So, of course, across the board, it's useful to think about how do we minimize poaching. And I think that there are campaigns that exist to try and, for example, run campaigns in the countries like China and Vietnam that are the markets for these horns, and try to educate them about what's going on in the supply countries, etc. Then, of course, there's a lot of work around, reducing corruption, etc., to minimize the flow of illegal horns. And then within parks themselves, they have to think, well, how do they at a site level mitigate against poaching? And even the Kruger now is talking about moving rhinos into more consolidated areas that they can more effectively and easily protect from poaching. In the private sector, we see these reserves. They report spending over 2 million rand a year on anti-poaching security. That amounts to about 28,000 rand per year per rhino. And those measures can be really effective. We see that these private reserves have much lower poaching rates than parks like the Kruger, because they are spending this large amount of money, and they have these quite small properties and populations of rhinos compared to the Kruger, which do make them easier to protect from poaching. So there's a lot of efforts, I think, to try and reduce poaching, but the question is who's footing the bill for those? And particularly when it comes to private rhinos, is it fair to expect them to keep footing the bill? Or if they can't anymore, what we're also seeing is a lot of those rhino owners are selling their rhino. They're disinvesting from rhino because they can no longer sustain those rising costs. So then we think, well, what else can we do to support those landowners?
We are going to continue our chat just now. We just got a break for an advert. Ons is nou terug. Dr. Clements, I think one of the big questions is how does the numbers, the rhino population, how does it compare when we look at how they look in South Africa and in the bigger Africa picture?
Yeah, that's an important consideration. And also what we try to alert people to in this paper is that even though South Africa conserves most of the white rhinos, about 80% of the white rhinos, as well as a fair proportion of the black rhinos, other important range states, for example, of black rhino on Namibia, as well as we see rhinos, for example, in some of the East African countries, as well as Botswana and Zimbabwe. What we are seeing across the board is that private landowners and communities are contributing a growing proportion of the properties that conserve rhinos. So the trends we see in South Africa, even though South Africa maybe conserves more rhinos and particularly has this huge private sector role to play in rhino conservation, we are actually seeing similar trends across the continent. In terms of poaching rates, some countries are withholding the effects of poaching better than others. This also fluctuates through time. But of course, this pressure that poaching is providing for the rhino population is felt in all the rhino range states. And as a result, the continental number of white rhinos is now declining.
Sure. What do you feel, or what do you think, what do you demand that people, and I'm talking now about the general public, what should people stop doing when it comes to the fight to protect our rhinos. And to put my question in context is, don't post when you are at a place and say, we're here, oh, look at the rhinos. What would you say should people just stop doing? You've got a platform here.
I mean, I think there's maybe more to say about what people should start doing as opposed to stop doing. But in terms of what they should stop doing, you know, your example is a good one. We do really need to be sensitive to information around rhinos because, of course, that is utilized
absolutely
by these poaching syndicates. So caution around that, that is important. What people can start doing is you know, recognizing the crisis on our hands, but also the broader importance of conservation, both in state parks and on private land, and how that can be supported. So visiting these parks, paying the entry fees, for example, that money goes towards conservation. And at the end of the day, you know, that's what funds conservation on both private properties and in state parks. So I think that's really important. And I think what's also important is that, as you say, you know, there are heated debates about whether we should be hunting rhinos, whether we should be trading rhinos, whether we should be trading their horns. And again, I think, you know, everyone feels like they have a stake in rhino conservation around the world. Everybody cares about rhinos. But at the end of the day, we also need to listen to the people that are on the ground tasked with conserving these rhinos. So I think what people can also start doing is listening to the needs of the people on the ground that are conserving rhinos, and for those to more strongly inform the debate.
What would you like the message to be when people read the article, if the study or the article finds the general public? What's that message that you hope just lands home?
I think that the message is that we need to recognize that conservation is not only the role of the government in state-owned parks. Actually, there are many role players in conservation, and rhinos is a good example of that, where private landowners and communities actually make a huge contribution towards conserving the species. And so we really need to recognize that role and to understand how best to support it.
Have you got any final thoughts?
I guess the final thought is that conservation of our planet is something that we all care strongly about. And of course, that means, you know, supporting the parks that conserve the species that remain, but it also means being cognizant in the decisions that we make on a daily basis to live in a sustainable way that contributes to conserving our natural world.
Absolutely. Doctor, thank you. Thank you for your knowledge, and just thank you for sharing it with me and with us. Have a great day, and keep up the good work.
My pleasure, Mia. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you.
It's lovely.